And that still got your, oh,
We're going to come back to order, court being in session. Okay, what I'd like for lawyers to do on closing, I'd like to limit them to 1 hour, and hopefully we can keep within that or close there too, okay? All right, we're going to bring them in and start the first argument. Joe Anderson? Not just acknowledging. I guess after the first argument, I'm going to give the jury a little bit of a break because they've only
all rise.
7 minutes. All right, please be seated. We're ready for closing argument. And I just mentioned to the lawyers, after the state's first argument, I'm going to let you get the rest of your morning break because this was a very abbreviated break, so we'll take about a 10-minute break after the first argument, and then we'll go from there. Okay? All right. Oh, I did not. Formally, for the record, Mr. Hopkins, do you have any other proof?
No, Your Honor, defense rests.
All right. Defense is resting. Okay.
On August 10th, 2017, Joanna Ortega was having an ordinary, typical kind of day. She was 12 years old. She spent the morning with her brother Oscar, her sister Jocelyn, and her mom, Patricia. It was a Thursday in early August, and the new school year had just begun, but Joanna didn't go to school that day because she had hurt her ankle, and her mom wanted her to stay off it and rest it so it would heal. So on that Thursday, Oscar and Jocelyn went to school, and Joanna stayed home with her mom, Patricia. But Patricia was a working mom, and she had to work that day, so she spent the morning with with Joanna. She made her favorite lunch, and she sat with her while she ate her lunch. But Patricia had to go to work. So around midday, she left for work, and she left Joanna home alone. And Joanna was home alone doing the types of things you might expect any 12-year-old kid to do. In her bedroom, surrounded by a messy room with 2 girls with clothes and blankets and shoes and purses and book bags, and the Taekwondo belts that she and her sister were so proud to have earned, Joanna Ortega was home alone, laying in her bed, playing on her iPad, listening to her headphones, and eating junk food. But what started out as an ordinary, typical kind of day did not end that way. Because as you've heard from the proof, there was a man there. A man who lived mostly out of a shed behind a trailer, just maybe 100 feet or so, one trailer in between them away. And this man decided he wanted to get into Joanna's trailer that day. He wanted to get in to C2. So around 4:15 p.m., the proof shows from the text message that Joanna sent, this man came to the front door of C2 and he knocked on the door. And that scared Joanna. And what does a scared child do when they're scared? They call their mom. So Joanna Ortega called her mom, and she tried to text her mom. And she said, "Mom, there's someone knocking on the door." About 5 minutes later, she texted her mom. She said, "I think he's gone." It was the man who cut the lawn. But he wasn't gone. He was just going to find a different way into that trailer. And he was familiar with that trailer. He was familiar with the windows on that trailer. He was familiar with where the wooded tree line was. So we went around to the back of the trailer, along the thick wooded tree line that you can't see from the street. He pried open the back master bathroom window. And while Joanna Ortega was laying in her bed on her iPad in the front of the trailer, this man was climbing in through a window in the back. This man entered into Joanna's room. And from the scene evidence, it's clear Joanna didn't get very far. He struck her in the head, causing subgaleal bleeding underneath her scalp, bruising around her eyes. She fell and sustained an impact to her cheek in a right angle consistent with the dresser next to her bed. And her body fell in between the narrow space between her dresser and her bed, on top of her clothes and her blankets, taekwondo belts, shoes. And the man pulled her pants down and her underwear down, exposing her genitalia, and he pulled them down below her thighs. And he took one of those taekwondo belts that Joanna and her sister were so proud to have earned, and he tied it around Joanna's neck, and he started to pull tight. And he pulled so tight that it caused little blood vessels to rupture in her face, around her eyes, and her lips, and behind her ears. And he pulled so tight that it caused the corneas of her eyes to fill up with blood. And he pulled so tight that it impeded the flow of blood and oxygen through Joanna's neck. And after a little while, Joanna went unconscious. And after a few minutes, according to Dr. Lee's testimony, of applying that pressure, Joanna Ortega died. And the man left. And he left Joanna's body there in that narrow space between her bed and her dresser, on top of her clothes and her blankets and her shoes and her purse and her book bags and all those things. Left her there for her mom to find 2 hours later. And the man who did that, the man who went into that trailer that day, is that man, Roy Coons. That is what the proof has shown. My intent in this closing argument is not to go through every minute detail of all of the evidence that you've heard in this case. Because you've been here, you've been paying attention, you've heard the proof, and if I did that, we'd be here another week, and nobody wants that. So I'm going to do two things in this argument. I'm going to go through the elements of the crimes. After all the arguments are done, and before you retire to the deliberation room, you're going to get instructions from Judge Watkins, and there are going to be a lot of instructions about how you deliberate, and he's going to give you the elements of the offenses that are charged. So you're going to have those, but I want to go over those elements with you briefly here just so that we can talk about what the elements are and you know what they are. After we go through the elements we're going to talk about, I'm going to talk to you about the most important pieces of proof. Sort of the categories of proof that are the most important that show beyond a reasonable doubt that Roy Coons is guilty. So let's talk about the first count. First degree premeditated murder. These are the elements. That the defendant unlawfully killed Joanna Ortega, that he acted intentionally, that he had the conscious objective to cause her death, and that the killing was premeditated. Well, you probably remember from jury selection we talked about premeditation. This is the definition. I'm not going to read the whole thing for you. But the important thing to remember is what we talked about in jury selection is that premeditation takes only that moment of reflection and judgment, does not require someone to be laying in wait. There's no definite period of time. That moment of reflection and judgment can be formed in an instant, or in a short period of time. Remember the car at the yellow light example that was used in jury selection. And that it's immaterial that the person would have been under a state of passion and excitement as long as they have that reflection and judgment and make that decision. So how do we know there's premeditation here? Well, there's 2 points. The first one's pretty simple. Strangulation. Strangling someone is not easy. You heard from Dr. Lee it takes several minutes to kill someone from strangulation. You have to apply several pounds of pressure to their neck. Strangulation does not only require reflection and judgment, it requires deliberate attention. Deliberate, intentional, personal attention is a very personal and deliberate and direct way to kill someone, and in and of itself, premeditation is suggested by strangulation. The other thing is that the defendant had a very logical reason to kill Joanna, and that is she couldn't be left alive. She couldn't be left alive to tell about what he had done. She couldn't be left alive to say that she saw him in that trailer. So he had to kill her. Counts 2 and 3 are in the same slide because they're both felony murder. We talked about in jury selection that felony murder is when there's a certain crimes that are so serious that if someone dies within the course of that crime, it doesn't matter if the person intended to kill them. It's just that the underlying crime was committed and that a person died in the course of that crime. So here we have 2 counts of felony murder. The first in count 2 is for the attempted rape of a child count, and the second is for aggravated burglary. If you find that the defendant committed attempted rape of a child and aggravated burglary, that he intended to commit those offenses, and that Joanna died, then he's guilty of both counts 2 and 3. Count 4 is the attempted rape of a child. These elements are the elements of attempt. And I'm going to read this to you because this is probably the most complicated legal concept you're going to have. We have to show that the defendant intended to commit rape of a child and that he did some act intending to complete a course of action or cause a result that would constitute rape of a child under the circumstances as the defendant believed them to be at the time. And his actions constituted a substantial step toward the commission of rape of a child. Well, what's our substantial step? What shows our intent? Pulling down her pants, pulling down her underwear. We talk about attempt, so what is rape of a child? This is all that rape of a child is. It is the unlawful sexual penetration of the victim, and that the victim was less than 13 years old. Well, we know Joanna was 12 years old at the time of this offense. But the term sexual penetration under Tennessee law requires some definition. And it means all of these things. The definition is in front of you. Sexual intercourse, cunnilingus, fellatio, anal intercourse, or any other intrusion, however slight, of any part of a person's body into the genital or anal openings of the alleged victims, or vice versa of the defendant. Any penetration, however slight, of any part of the body. That's all that's required for rape of a child. Now, you heard from Dr. Lee that he cannot say from looking at Joanna's body, from looking at her genitals, that there was any trauma to her genitals. But he also told you that that doesn't necessarily mean that there wasn't any penetration. The truth is, it's unclear from the proof. There's no way to know if she was penetrated or not. That's why this is charged as attempt. And that's why we have the proof of that substantial step of pulling down her pants and underwear. Finally is count 5, which is especially aggravated burglary. Here are the elements. The defendant entered a habitation. He entered with intent to commit an assault. That he did not have the effective consent of the owner, which is Patricia Velasquez. That the victim suffered serious bodily injury, which clearly she did because Joanna died. And that he acted either intentionally, knowingly, or recklessly. The important thing about this to note is that you're going to notice that count 5 is charged especially aggravated burglary. But when you look at the felony murder count, where the underlying offense is burglary, it just says aggravated burglary. And I don't want that to confuse you. Aggravated burglary is a lesser included offense of especially aggravated burglary. If he's guilty of especially aggravated burglary, then he's guilty of aggravated burglary. Because aggravated burglary is just this without serious bodily injury. Entering into the habitation with the intent to commit an assault without the consent of the owner. So it's a little strange how it was charged that the felony murder count, all we have to show is the aggravated burglary. But clearly we also have especially aggravated burglary because we have the serious bodily injury. But I submit to you that there's really no question that the elements of these offenses happen. There's really no question that someone committed these offenses and that these elements are satisfied. The major question in this case, then, is who did it? Who committed these offenses? Who killed Joanna Ortega? So let's talk about all the evidence that shows that Roy Coons is guilty of these offenses. I submit to you there are 7 main areas of proof that I want to talk about that all point to Roy Coons. 1 is his inconsistent statements with respect to the timeline. 2 is his opportunity and proximity to the murder. 3 is his suspicious behavior. 4 is his statements to Moses Okoth and Alexander Hemingway. 5 is his strange statements to the detectives. 6 is the text message sent by Joanna Ortega. And 7 is DNA. Remember, when you go back in that jury deliberation room to consider this proof, you're not just considering one thing. You're considering all these things together. That's the important point. It's not just DNA, it's DNA plus all of these other things. So let's talk about timeline. You've heard a lot of proof about timeline stuff on August 10, 2017. You've heard about cell site data that shows locations on the towers. You've heard 2 statements from Roy Coons Jr., but you heard it kind of piecemeal. So let's put it all together. On August 10, 2017 at 4:15 p.m. in 16 seconds, Joanna texts, "Mom, somebody is knocking on the door." A few seconds later, she tries to correct her misspelling of door. She corrects it again correctly a few seconds after that to puerta. Sometime around possibly 4:16, we know from the screenshot that was taken at 4:19 that the call was 3 minutes ago. She tried to call her mom, but we don't have an exact time. But we know she tried to call her mom and she didn't answer. At 4:18 and 35 seconds, she said, "He's gone," and she misspells "flay," which she corrects a few seconds after that. And then at 4:19 and 13 seconds, she says, "I think it was the man who cuts the yard." At 4:32 and 25 seconds, the cell site data shows that Roy Coons has an incoming call that goes to his voicemail. He doesn't answer, and he is in the trailer park. We know that from the face of the tower that it pings off of when he's in the trailer park. At 4:39, Coons calls his voicemail, and the cell site data from the cellular tower shows he's moving away into the direction of Cedar Hill Park at 4:39. At 5:13, he tries to make another call, and he's also away from the trailer park in the same direction. And sometime in the middle of Jeopardy, he comes and knocks on Madge Green's door. She remembers that Jeopardy had already started. He talks to her for a while, and he leaves near the end of Double Jeopardy. Now, Jeopardy starts at 5, so he's there sometime around 5:15. We don't know exactly, and he leaves before 5:30. And then the 911 call at 6:45 and 23 seconds, which you all heard. Why is this important? It shows the defendant is in the trailer park at the moment of opportunity for this crime, shortly after Joanna sends her last text that someone's knocking on the door. But it's also important because it shows he leaves the trailer park. He leaves the trailer park for a while and comes back. Now, why is that important? Because you heard 2 statements from the defendant to the detectives, and he never mentions in either of those statements what you see here on the cell site data, what you see from the locations, the hard proof. He never mentions that he left that trailer park for that period of time shortly after the murder. What possible reason could he have to leave out the fact that right after the victim sends her last text saying the man who cuts the lawn is outside, that he leaves? What are the timelines that he gives you in his statements? To Detective Bowden, he says he went to the mailbox at 3 o'clock when the kids were getting off the school bus. Then he says he stayed in his shed for the rest of the day watching Street Kings with his headphones on until he came out and saw all the blue lights. But he says a different timeline to Detective Hill and Detective Kotzman, and if this works, I'm going to play it for you because it's a short clip. And I want you to listen to his timeline now that you know what the cell site, the cell tower data shows. Now that you know he left that trailer park for that period of time. Listen to his statement because he never mentions it.
So I just want to make sure I understand your timeline for the day. You went for cigarettes around noon, between 11 and noon. And then from noon till about 3, you were here at the house.
Yeah.
And it feels pretty great if I get something wrong here.
Okay.
Who else was here?
Just me.
Just you.
They leave about 1:10, 1:15 to go to work.
So from noon to 1:15, y'all were together?
I mean, it was either in the house, we sat in and smoked, or I was in the shed.
Okay. And then, so from noon to 3, you were here, then you went down about 3 o'clock, walked past and picked up a piece of paper.
On the way back.
Yeah, on the way back. The kids were getting off the bus.
Yeah, they were getting off the bus as I was going down there. We kind of actually walked back at the same time. They was a little bit ahead of us, like I said, I was checking the mailbox and the mail. They was, from here to a great car for me.
From 3, so from 3 to about 5:15, we were back here.
Yeah.
And somewhere around 5:15 to 6 o'clock, we were talking to the woman at C9.
Yeah, around 5:45, something like that. C9.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we went to Cedar Hill Park.
Right.
We saw driving the white Mustang.
Right.
And then we were there for about 30 to 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And came straight back here.
Right.
Which you back here what about? We said shortly before police arrived.
Yeah, about 6:30, 6:45, something like that, maybe.
As you've heard throughout that entire statement and then through that sort of summarizing and catching it back up, the detectives are very deliberate about getting his timeline, asking where he went that day, and in neither of his statements does he mention this trip away from the trailer park at the most important time. There are a minimum of 34 minutes and 24 seconds that we know that the proof shows he is away from the trailer park. At least from 4:39 to 5:13, in that period of time, he leaves and he never mentions that to the detectives. He doesn't want the detectives to know that he left the trailer park shortly after the murder occurred. I submit to you that this is what the timeline is. I submit to you that this is what the proof shows. That at 4:15, Joanna sees him knocking on the door and she sends the text, he's at the door. At 4:19, she looks and he's gone, and she says he's gone, but he's not gone. He's going to get into that back window. At 4:32, he gets an incoming call, and it shows that he is in the trailer park. It's possible that at that time, he is still in that trailer committing that murder. At 4:39, he is going away from the trailer park, moving in the direction of Cedar Hill Park, and again at 5:13, he's still in that direction. He rushes back to the trailer park and goes barefooted to Madge's trailer to try to make an alibi for himself sometime midway through Jeopardy. I submit to you that's what the timeline shows. So that's his timeline and his inconsistent statements. The second thing is a simple one: opportunity and proximity. Remember, we're looking at everything all together, not just one little thing. And sometimes little things that don't mean much alone mean a lot in light of all the other proof. Well, it's significant that the defendant lives so close by this trailer that he's the opportunity and proximity, that he knows that there's a master bathroom window on that trailer that's blocked by a wooded tree line, and that's important. The third thing is his suspicious behavior. If you remember the testimony of Officer Brittany Sampson, she said that unlike anybody else, the defendant was lingering around the crime scene and asking questions. A little thing that becomes important in light of everything. During the canvassing with the officers, he gets upset and angry. He moved out of the shed behind his parents' trailer shortly after this murder occurred. And you just heard this morning the testimony from Roy Coons Sr. that the reason he gave, Dad, the reason I'm moving out of this trailer is because the apartment manager, the trailer manager, told me I couldn't be here anymore. Well, I submit to you that wasn't true. Because you heard from Anthony Hinton, the manager, he never said that. He never even met Roy Coons Jr. He never told him he couldn't be there. Why make up a reason why you have to leave? It's just these little suspicious behaviors. Do you remember back Tuesday morning, the very first witness, Patricia Velasquez? Seems like a long time ago, but she told you that sometime prior to this murder, when Roy Coons came to her door to get money for mowing the lawn, she went to get change. She noticed he was poking his head in and staring at the girls. It's these parts of suspicious behavior that add to the state's proof in this case. The next thing is his statements to Moses Okoff. and Alexander Hemingway. He asked Moses Okoth multiple times, do you think someone would be forgiven by God if they killed someone? And Alexander Hemingway corroborates that because she heard him asking that. And then there's the moment when he calls Moses over to his tent and he confesses to Moses Okoth that he has killed someone. And he says, that shit really sticks with you. Remember, this is just in September, 5 or so weeks after this murder occurred. And that scared the heck out of Moses. He told you he doesn't have hair, but he felt like his hair was standing up. And he went immediately back to his tent where Alex was and told her to be aware and be careful around Roy Coons Jr. The fifth thing is strange statements he made to the detectives. When he's talking to the detectives, other than his timeline not matching up with the cell tower evidence, he also says some other strange things that stick out. He talks to Josh Hill on August 17th in a phone call to set up their meeting, and then again on August 18th the next day. In both of those times, he knows that Joanna has been strangled. You heard testimony, this is only 7 and 8 days after the murder. You heard testimony from multiple police witnesses, including the lead detectives. That information was not public at the time the defendant knew it. It was not public that she had been strangled. He also knew there was an element of sexual assault. He said she was raped. That information was not public. Now, it has been suggested through questions that maybe word just got around. Maybe other people just knew about it and were talking about it in the trailer. Well, you heard from Madge. She didn't know about it. She says, I did not ever hear about strangulation. I did not ever hear about rape. And she told you she was talking to everybody about what could have happened. She said, all we knew is that the cause of death wasn't released. And this is just a week after the murder. He knows what happened in that trailer. The other thing is if it's true that he just heard this from gossip around the trailer park, why make up a reason where he heard it? Because he tells the detectives in the statement that you heard, oh, well, I heard that from Madge because Madge has a relative who's a detective. Well, you heard from Madge. She testified that's not true. I don't have a relative that's a detective, and I never said that to him. He's trying to find a reason to explain how he knows that, because he knows he made a mistake when he revealed to the detectives he knew that. There are some other little strange things in his statements that stick out. When he's asked, is there any reason your DNA might be on that girl? He says, well, no, I've shook her hand, but I haven't laid with her or anything. And then another time in the statement he says that he had shaken the girl's hands and laughed with them. Well, Patricia Velasquez and Jocelyn testified, we never met him, we never shook his hands. We didn't laugh with him. The sixth thing is Joanna's text messages. It's pretty simple, self-explanatory. Before 19 p.m., she identifies that the man who was knocking on the door of her trailer that day was the man who cuts the lawn. And all the proof you've heard has shown that Roy Coons was the man who cut their lawn at that trailer. So even before we get to the next thing, which is the DNA, there's a great deal of evidence that points directly at Roy Coons. But let's talk about DNA. Now, you heard almost an entire day of testimony about DNA from 4 different expert witnesses. And in this short time in this argument, I am not going to go through every little bit of all of that. You sat through testimony about picograms, micrograms, how many picograms are in a microgram and micrograms in a gram. You sat through testimony about how they make the racial group statistic modeling. You sat through testimony even about Civil War soldiers' bones and mummies. And you heard all that. And you know what to make of it. So I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about what this DNA actually shows with respect to that man. Because that's what's important. And this is the takeaway. DNA matching Roy Coons Jr. is found in that trailer 4 times. 3 times on Joanna's body, and 1 time on the windowsill on the inside that we know Joanna's murderer used. The proof shows that Joanna's murderer came in through that windowsill because Patricia told you that it was not in that state when she left, with the torn curtain and the shelf knocked over. So let's talk about the windowsill. This is the result from the true allele analysis from cybergenetics. There's a match on the window frame in Roy Coons, 990 million times more probable than a coincidental match to an unrelated Caucasian person. And Jennifer Horniak, the expert, testified that the probability of it being a random person is 1 in 7.11 billion. And remember, we're going to talk about the YSTR DNA in a moment, but remember, this is not YSTR. The DNA on that windowsill is full STR DNA. So this is not a match to Roy Coons' dad, it's not a match to his son, it's not a match to his paternal line. It is a match to him and only him to 1 in 7.1 billion. Why is the window so important? Well, there's pry marks on the outside of it. And I submit you can plainly see the fresh pry marks on both sides of the window. You can see where the locking mechanisms have been bent down. You can see where the curtain was torn when you came in through this window and fell, or maybe when you came out, it's not clear, but in one way in or out, he fell and tore the curtain and knocked over a shelf because Patricia testified it wasn't like that. And that he closed the window in such a hurry, he actually closed the torn curtain into the window. Make no mistake about it. The person who killed Joanna Ortega used this window. That man's DNA is on the inside of that window. Let's talk about the other DNA, the YSTR. Now you heard that YSTR is a little different than full STR DNA. That YSTR can only narrow it down to the paternal line. But it's in 3 places. The DNA swab on the right side of Joanna's face is a match to Roy Coons, and it's observed 0 times in 28,425 profiles, which Charlie Castellano testified is the best possible result in terms of the uniqueness of the match. The DNA swab from Joanna's right buttocks is also a match to Roy Coons in 0 of 2,094 profiles, and a DNA swab of her left arm is a match to Roy Coons in 0 in 26,009 profiles. And for each of those, every other standard compared was excluded. DNA matching Roy Coons is on her body not once, not twice, but 3 times. Now these are partial matches. And the question was asked then, well, how strong of a partial match? What is the number of locations? Well, for this one, it was 22 out of 27, almost a full match. 25 out of 27 for her buttocks, almost a full profile. And 24 out of 27. These are not a low number of locations. That's why the results are so strong in those data groups. That's why it's 0 other times it's ever been observed in the entire YSTR profile pool. And remember that the reporting threshold is 8. These are well below the reporting threshold. You also heard that the DNA under Joanna's fingernails is consistent with Roy Coons in 7 out of 8 locations. It's 1 location away from the TBI being able to call it a match, and that everybody else was excluded from those. I want to talk about transfer for a minute, because this is something you've heard a lot about, DNA transfer. Think about what you've actually heard about transfer, because it's pretty vague. You've heard it can happen, that it's been demonstrated in a lab, but only up to 6 times in a controlled setting in a short period of time. You've heard that DNA degrades over time, and that one of the things that degrade DNA are light, humidity, and chemicals. And you heard that it's less likely to transfer from a soft surface such as carpet, and that it was demonstrated in less than 1%. That's a lot, but I'm going to point to you what I submit is the most important thing for you to consider in terms of this transfer argument. And that is where the DNA is. Because there are 2 locations in that trailer that the proof shows you can be confident that the murderer was the victim's body and the windowsill. Roy Coons' DNA is in those 2 locations and only those 2 locations. Not once, not twice, but 4 times. Remember in opening argument, Mr. Hopkins said, well, his DNA should be all over that trailer because he did so much work in that trailer. It's not. You know that because you sat through what felt like a 10-point font, narrow margin, 14-page chart that took about an hour and a half or 2 hours to go through that showed every single thing that the police tested for DNA in this apartment, and it is an enormous amount of stuff. They tested stuff that came off the carpet. They tested the bed that's been in that trailer since before this family even moved in there. They tested everything in that trailer, and they never found Roy Coons' DNA except for in 2 places. On the victim's body and on the windowsill that we know the murderer used. One of the things you heard about transfer is that, well, that trace DNA degrades in light and humidity. Well, one of the places where the DNA is, the one that matches 1 in 7.11 billion, is on the interior of a windowsill, which would be exposed to light, in a bathroom where there's going to be a lot of humidity. This family lived in that trailer for around 2 years. The previous occupant died 2 years earlier. Patricia testified that Roy Coons never set a single foot in that trailer in the time that she lived there. So what is this suggestion of transfer? What would you actually be believing if you believe this suggestion of transfer? We learned that today, this morning from Roy Coons Sr., that Roy Coons stretched the carpet in that room, and that's the only time that they can say he was ever in that bedroom, and that he was only in there stretching the carpet. I think he said 20 to 30 minutes to stretch it. So this is what the transfer argument is expecting you to accept, that from within 6 months to a year before the last occupant died, over 2 years ago, Roy Coons was in that trailer. And that after all that time, after those years passed, that his DNA sat dormant in there, through all the vacuumings and cleanings and transfer and walking in and out and moving stuff, and over 2 years later, on August 10th, 2017, his DNA just so happens to show up in the 2 locations that we know that the murderer touched her body and the windowsill. That would be a coincidence that strains the edges of reason. And that's what brings me to this. Common sense. You might remember in jury selection, General Anderson asked, well, does everybody have common sense? And everybody kind of chuckled. But now, after sitting through a week of this trial, you might see why that's actually a good question. It's because sometimes in trials like this, you might wonder, well, am I allowed to apply my common sense? Well, that's why this instruction is going to be in your jury instructions that you get from Judge Watkins. And it says, you should consider all the evidence in the light of your own observations and experiences in life. Take your common sense into that jury deliberation room with you. I just want to leave you with one last point. Because we've talked a lot about Roy Coons. We've talked a lot about what Roy Coons said, what he did 2.5 years ago, where he's been, what he said to the detectives, etc., etc. But don't forget the other person that this trial is about. It's about Joanna. It's about what happened to her on that Thursday in that trailer. Obviously, she's not here anymore, so she can't come in here and sit on that stand and testify about what happened to her. But you did get to hear some of her words in this trial this week. And it's this. She sent these messages in August of 2017, almost 2 years ago. And this is not just some data, this is actually the picture. This is the screenshot that her iPad took when she closed out of Google Hangouts for the last time shortly before she was killed. From August of 2017 to this courtroom this week in July of 2019, you are looking at one of the last images that she ever looked at. This is the last time she ever talked to her mom. And she is identifying who the man is who came to her trailer that day. You have heard an enormous amount of proof in this case, and it all points to Roy Coons, to that man. And now I submit to you that the answer is right in front of you. It's right in front of you. In Joanna's words from almost 2 years ago to you here today, Roy Coons murdered Joanna Ortega. He is guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Find him guilty.
Going to take a 10-minute break, finish up.
All rise.